Okay, so up next, we have Boss Grollemann, who's going to be talking about using Puppet on Windows, some of the do's and don'ts associated with that. or just don't.
Let's see. Hello, everybody. So, who uses Windows with Puppet? Let's get started with that. A few, and the rest is lucky. Okay, well, for those that aren't using Puppet with Windows, stay around for a great look at what you're missing. So let's get started with who am I. I'm Bas Grollemann. I'm a freelance Puppet engineer. Been messing as a freelancer for around 8-9 years now, and started with Puppet around 6. When I got to eBay and some guys told me, we're working with Puppet here. Great, what is it? Well, I enjoyed the first years in blissful Linux-only Debian environments, but as freelance goes, that changes a bit. I'm also training to be a Scrum Master now, because when they call in the freelancer, it's usually a large backlog and a lot of bugs. And I'm trying to use that to make sure that the company has enough time to improve their Puppet code and not just fix whatever has been lying around the longest. A quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to do a quick on why Windows. Why did I start with it? Why would you want to work with Windows? Then I'm going to have a list of do's, list of don'ts. Have a quick recap so that you know what's been discussed, and then there will be time for questions, if there are any. So yeah, that's the one first. Why Windows? Well, yeah, I'm not going to lie about I don't like Windows that much, but I also don't like Macs. I don't like avocados. So there's plenty of things I don't like in the world, but in the end, it all boils down to one thing when you're a freelancer. The question you get, we need this, you seem smart, can you fix this for us? This initially started for me at Kobo. I don't know if you know Kobo, the ebook company. They have a lot of Windows. They are trying to get rid of it, but they still have a lot of Windows. And basically when I got there, the machines were, when they're getting installed, were rebooting like 5 to 8 times. And it was inconsistent. Now, if there's one thing you don't like when you're provisioning machines with code is inconsistency. So somebody had to solve that pain, and I volunteered. I'm not saying happily. I did enjoy it at some point because I like solving problems, but that's basically how I got started. The do's. I'm mostly going to talk about the do's. I'm a positive-looking guy. I like stuff I can do. There's a few things on the don'ts list that I learned the hard way, and I hope to avoid it for the few Windows guys in the room. This would be the main one. If you're running a Windows setup, upgrade your Puppet. And at least 3.3, probably preferably the latest version, but the reason why I'm specific at 3.3 is because at that point in time, Puppet added a few changes and the reboot module came into place, which I'll discuss later, but reboots are a part of the Windows life. It's not very nice, but it's part of the Windows life. This one's obvious, clean code. But what do I mean with clean code? If you start, I'm guessing most people that are running Windows have a mixed environment. You usually end up with Linux and Windows code. And if you're not careful, then you have these huge lines of code with a lot of if-then case statements, what if Windows, what if. You learn later on that it's better to keep them separated, to make sure that there's like either, if you're lucky, you can just keep it generic, which would be ideal, like user management, for example, is pretty easy to combine. But sooner or later, you'll have files in different locations, or even worse, total different solutions, and then you need case statements. In practice, what I do is I keep the generic stuff on top of the module, and then use a case statement which very specifically say this part's for the Linux side, and this part's for the Windows side. And a little trick I started picking up at some point is that if you skip something on the Windows side or on the Linux side because it's specific for an OS, add like one comment line in there stating why you skipped it. Because when you're looking at the same code 3 months later and you're wondering why doesn't it manage it, you're just reinventing the wheel because you're figuring out again to get to the same conclusion. No, this doesn't work on Windows. So that one's pretty important. Another thing we do is putting it in separate files. So sometimes when it's really large code, for example, when we have like a base module, which is the basic setup, the things we do is have like a base generic stuff, and then we load a Linux separate class and a Windows class. But this is more how you like to work. Reboots, my favorite topic. So yeah, the problem with reboots is that ideally you want your machine configured in a single Puppet run, everything checked. And then a reboot happens midstream. So Puppet's busy working on stuff and the system just halts because Windows decided that last software update, that one needs a reboot. So let's do it right away. This is why you need 3.3. The Puppet Labs made a reboot module, and the idea is that when you install software, you try to combine as many installations as possible, and then group those to a single reboot. Another bonus is that when you use the reboot module, Puppet invalidates all the other changes that are still to be done, but have to be done after the reboot. This avoids this inconsistency problem they had with Kobo as well, because what happened is that the software would install, Windows would reboot, this would vary in time depending on how fast the machine was, so it would break mid-making changes in files, mid-installations of new stuff, and usually emits a lot of errors because they couldn't find PowerShell 3.0. So yeah, reboots is something you have to keep in mind. Usually you'll be able to get it down from a clean install to about 2. One reboot to get the basics installed, like .NET 4.5 and PowerShell. This is the most common case. And then a second reboot after everything is configured. It's also not very consistent. It's not like a size thing. Some things you install are huge and they don't require a reboot. Other things are like 2K and they say, well, we need a reboot right away. And it's tricky, but you have to keep it in mind. PowerShell. Well, I'm not going to lie, I don't know PowerShell in depth. I steal everything from Google. But I did have a chat with the guy that originally set up the PowerShell in Windows. He was at DevOps this year in Amsterdam. He held an interesting talk about the fight he had as a Unix guy in a Microsoft environment. I think he's very brave for trying. I'm also very thankful because PowerShell is much better than the default command line tool. It's no bash. I did learn that there's a few huge differences. One of the main ones is that PowerShell is object-based instead of text-based. So all the Linux guys in here, we know we pipe data from A to B and it's text so you can read it and do stuff with it. And with PowerShell, and that one I had to get used to really, is it sends objects. So it sends like an NTP object or a service object. There's tricks for that. I have a link to a 1.5-hour video online that explains how you figure out what objects comes out of a command, if another command accepts that object, and what you can do to transfer it. To give a painful example, you can, for example, get like a list of services, and then you can send the list of services to the kill process command. This sounds painful enough as it is, but if you realize that it just passes on the service ID to the kill process command, which kills the process ID, you get nice random results. And a very unstable system. This is like a painful example. I don't think many people will. But what happens is that, for example, somebody would look up a service, send it to the kill process command, and kill a random thing on their device. So yeah, if you're working with PowerShell, it's very good to remember the object build way. There's 2 modules on the moment. I use the one from Josh Cooper. This will allow you to use exec with PowerShell. Puppet Labs has introduced one. I'm not sure how recently, but I started seeing it when I was going over the Forge. I'm not sure how good it is. If anybody has experience with it, I would like to hear so. But for now, I'm just keeping what's working. Another great tip, which I discovered later, if you are scripting PowerShell, in the Start menu, you'll be able to find the PowerShell ISE, which is an integrated development environment which autocompletes stuff, so you spend less time browsing the internet and more time actually trying stuff out, like killing your system. The registry. Oh, great joy. The registry is nice in one way. The idea is okay. You make like a huge database to put all your settings in. And it has one advantage above files, and that's that it gets auto-reloaded most of the time. So when you make an update to the registry, most applications know straight away when they're using it. Saves you from having to run a reload, which the Linux guys are used to. Another thing that's different is that you very often have to start looking here. It's not file-based. I'll have a chat about that one a bit later in the don'ts. And it has a very good Puppet Labs module as well, which makes it very easy to set up keys and groups and keep the code nice and concise. If you're working on Windows, you'll be spending a lot of time in the registry. Chocolatey. Yeah, this is definitely one of those things that cost me a lot of time. So I heard about Chocolatey when I started with Windows. It was some kind of package management. But thought, how bad can it be? You know, I just have to install a few executables. I'll manage it by hand. And it will take a month before I get all the switches right. This is, if you get starting with Windows, or if you're working with Windows, make some time to try out Chocolatey. It's a bit of work initially, because you have to read a few documents and get it installed. But it saves a lot of time, because then you actually start to use packages like you're used to in the Linux environment. You specify which software and which version, and it gets installed instead of you finding the executable, downloading it, and then spending a nice happy hour or two Googling to find the switch which avoids it rebooting automatically after installing. It's a good tool. It doesn't cover everything. I think they have around 4,000 software installations now, and common problem with Windows is that software very often isn't publicly available. If you have one of those cases, then you're very often too bad. And add checks. So this one I started doing only recently, but it's already saving me a lot. I wrote a small set of defines that check if it's a Windows system or if it's a Linux system, and started loading those in my custom modules for the company I'm working for at the moment. The idea here is that very often you're loading a few things in the base class, and at some point either a Linux-only module or a Windows-only module gets loaded on the wrong side of the fence. And if you're lucky, it will just fill out and you know that something's wrong. If you're not in luck, then it will run and stuff start happening which you're not expecting. So my option is there, try to fill early. Add a lot of fills in the code if stuff isn't running on the system it's supposed to run. It will save you a lot of headaches, because I'm much more happy when my Puppet stops working and stops making changes on a system than if it starts making bad changes on a system. That one's just much harder to fix. Open source. Yeah, well, the Windows side isn't as well developed as the Linux side yet. So spend some time looking at modules, updating modules. A friend of mine, Greg Traher, once told me that pull request, I was very reluctant to do that, and one night we were having a beer, and he was saying, you know, don't care about those guys. Just send in a pull request, they either accept it or they don't, but don't start filling your code till you think it's perfect. The best thing to do when updating modules to add Windows support, for example, I did this for CheckMK that had pure Linux support, is fork it on GitHub, add your Windows code, send in a pull request. You'll either get a response with I'm missing AIZ, and you can fix that and it gets merged back into the main branch. Or what happened in my case, the original author of the module didn't spend much time on it, and people started forking my fork to continue my Windows development. Which works, you know. In both cases, at least I saved one guy figuring out and installed CheckMK on Windows, which is a win in my book. So don't worry about it too much. Just put it public. And if somebody says, well, you know, I think it looks terrible, well, hey, it's public, you know, fork it, fix it. So we're getting to the don'ts. Don'ts, yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff to do. I think most people figured the first one out, don't do Windows. That was the easiest one. You won't get away with that very often at bigger companies. That's the first one. I really hate it when people start getting, this thing needs to have a domain controller. You basically get two captains on a ship. Because the domain controller has stuff it wants to manage on the Windows box, and Puppet wants to manage stuff on the Windows box. Sooner or later, people are going to they're both going to want to change the same thing. So if you can't avoid the domain controller, start monitoring your Puppet for changes that start happening frequently. So you don't change any code and it makes changes every day. That usually means that at some point the domain controller is changing something which Puppet is changing as well, which is bad, because it means that the machine is in two states during a day, maybe two states in an hour, depending a bit on how often the domain controller thinks it should be fixed and how often Puppet thinks it should be fixed. One of the two has got to give. Reality learns that very often it's Puppet that has to give because you're the more flexible guy. Or the guy managing the domain controller doesn't know which dialog he needs to switch it on. Don't try to solve it in Jira. I've seen this one happen a lot as well. What happens is that people basically adjust the settings they use in Jira so that it works in Windows. But then the problem is when you have issues on Windows or you try to deploy it on a new Windows system and you don't have access to the exact same Jira data, you're running around finding what settings you need. A module should be, in my opinion at least, self-contained. You should be able to run it on either Windows or Linux, and it should work with the defaults. Even if the defaults is just don't do anything, but it should have some same defaults and explain to you why you want these settings. This is one that I see very often. It also happens a lot in the Linux world with different distros. That people have like the OS sign in there so they can pick data depending on the system. I still don't consider that good practice because you're basically having a runaround. You have to go into 3 or 4 systems to figure out why is it behaving differently on this install than on another. So it's more generic. And this one, don't make slashes. Well, anybody who's worked with Windows started to type front slashes and then Windows telling them it's wrong because he can't process the switches. Puppet is very smart. It tries to get the right switches, so like bar slashes, forward slashes, or backward slashes, and that works excellent for the file command. I mean, in that case, you can just use forward slashes and it will make backward slashes. Everybody will be happy. And then some point later, you'll use the same variable in an executable command. So you basically pass it through Powershell and give it to a Windows executable who will barf straight away, saying like, I don't know how to do this, and then you have to go back through your code and find all the slashes. Rule of thumb, when in doubt, use the double backslash. It's a bit more typing, it's a bit more work, but the file command will work with both entries because it will fix it, and the execute command will only work with the backslashes. So fixing yourself on the backslashes usually saves a lot of time, unless you're really specifically writing code for it. This one's definitely for people coming from a Linux environment. We're used to file-based things. Change stuff in procs, change stuff in etc. Update a file, reload the service, everybody's happy. And then you get to Windows and you realize that nothing is file-based. Well, Internet Information Service a bit, but the rest is all objects, registries. So when looking for a solution, let go of changing a file or finding a file that updates, because you'll probably be searching forever. You'll have to start Google for it, and you'll sooner or later figure out that there's some command, change a switch, and this is most of the time when doing Windows stuff. You have to figure out which switch to run on something. If you're lucky, then there's help, and help is also something you start learning, because for some it's /?, others is -- help, some have a man page, like on the internet. This is the main pain point I have with when working with Windows. I have to figure out a lot of stuff. Unless you have pure Microsoft software, in which case you're golden, because that Microsoft at least has some standard. But they have a lot of people. Case in point example was installing Microsoft Visual Studio. This is like a 6 CD installation. I had 10 minutes and I got it installed with Puppet. Everything running. I was like totally happy. So that was easy. And then I got another file from someone said, like, we need this really small executable. It was like a .exe from 1 MB size. I said, that should be easy. I spent 2 days debugging, figuring out how to get it installed. So if somebody asks you to install something, I usually say, okay, I need some research time, and I start checking, is it using defaults? Is it using Chocolatey? I have to figure it out myself. Then I try to install it manually, and if it can't fix it in 5 minutes, I schedule 2 days for it to get something installed automatically. So we're getting to the recap. I'm just going to quickly go over the topics I had. Make sure Puppet is upgraded. Clean code, keep the stuff separated in your code, make it easy to read for yourself. You're usually debugging left or right, so it's nice if you can quickly go through it. Keep the reboots in mind. You won't be able to avoid it. You might be able to get it down by having a good provisioned image with all the required software installed, but it's going to get to you at some point when people want to upgrade Powershell from 3.4. Personally, I would just tell them to reinstall, but that doesn't seem to be the Windows way, because then they start asking, yeah, but we have to re-enter the license key. PowerShell, get to at least 3.0. I believe 4 is out, but I haven't had time yet to play with it. Registry, if you have never ever touched the registry, lucky you, but if you know where it is, then you know how it works, how the structure is. If not, open the registry editor for once and just browse through it. You'll quickly see that it's a tree-based structure. You won't learn everything from it, but at least you'll have a rough idea at what you're working at. Spend some time with Chocolatey. It's not that hard to get up and running. It's a bit harder to get it automatically installed. But once you have, it will save you a lot of time when people ask you to install software. Check, fail early, fail often. Mainly when you're in a mixed environment. It's much better to fail when code gets run that wasn't designed for a certain operating system than it is to just let Puppet try and see how far it gets. And open source, because there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and basically we're all busy. So I would like to avoid doing much Windows debugging and just deploying the Windows machines and get on with my day. Then the don'ts. Try to avoid getting a domain controller. People will ask, say no again. They'll ask another time, and then maybe give in, but give them a good reason. At least ask, why do you need a domain controller? Because very often you'll get back, yeah, but that's what Microsoft says. No. Repeat the one. I forgot to mention that during the domain controller part. Also avoid user management as soon as you get a domain controller, because then definitely you're going to get into trouble, because it's possible to have 2 exact same usernames with a different domain on Windows. And I've spent plenty of time people bugging, I can't log in. Do not try to solve it in Jira. While possible and maybe even doable with some extension where you keep the Jira code with your module, it usually becomes like this runaround, searching, finding solutions. Don't make slashes. It's common, forward slashes, backward slashes. This is the main difference between Unix and Windows. When in doubt, use the double backslash, because that will work both for the file and the executable command and most other resources. And finally, don't think file-based. This is just something you have to let go of when you're from a Unix environment. So any questions?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first one is, we have some various versions of Windows. Which one do we use? Which one should I use if I use Windows? Or can I use?
So the question was, we have multiple versions of Windows, and which version of Windows should I use? The current setup I'm running on runs 2008. Usually it's more dependent on the software you're installing. So depending on if you're installing EES or anything from Microsoft, they'll usually recommend getting the latest version. Yeah, this is for stability. Personally, on the moment, I'm still sticking with 2008. but we're looking into getting to 2012 because well, it's getting outdated now. So we're like in this transition phase. If you have to start from scratch, go straight to 2012 at least.
My second question is, you said don't use a domain controller, but if you are in bigger companies which only use Windows, you don't have the option to do not use it, because they have one, they have Active Directory, user management all over the Microsoft stuff. How do you handle this?
Yeah, so when you're forced into having a domain controller, and at least they have a good reason for it, like central user management, which is a hard point to put aside. Keep in mind that there are two captains on the ship. So when you're doing Puppet changes, like I mentioned in the presentation, check if Puppet's making changes every day, even if you're not updating your Puppet code. Because that usually means that you're fighting with the domain controller over something. And something has to give, in this case. That's about the issue. You're working around it most of the time. It's hard. It's not impossible, but it costs some time. Also, make sure that you mention that up front. When you do get a domain controller, it's going to take a bit more work. Does that answer the question a bit? Great. Any other questions? Well, I only had like 3 Windows guys, so I mean, I don't expect much. Yes?
You mentioned the user module especially as a hot point with the domain controller.
Yeah.
Are there any other modules we have to look out for?
I haven't had the question yet on the end. Users is very specific, because that's definitely a point the domain controller picks up. I haven't really had much run-ins in other sites. You usually have to check in stuff like licensing, because the licenses usually come through the domain controller. This can both be a benefit, because you don't have to manage the license, but it can also be a problem, because when you're rolling out machines, definitely if you're like a continuous integration environment, you'll have to spend some time, if there is a domain controller, at least in making Puppet manage the connection with the domain controller. Because very often they'll expect you to sign up with the central domain controller, and as we all know, manual work is bad. So I think those two are the main points, and for the rest it's very specific depending on which software installations you require. Some are very dependent on the domain controllers. Well, in that case people have a good reason, so then there's also a reason to spend some engineering time on it. And the other is keep track of the logs. Make sure that checking if Puppet's changes don't get reverted, because that's the main risk you're running. I see all the way in the back.
First me. So what kind of systems did you manage with Puppet? Did you set up SQL Server, IIS? What kind of
So within
components
Kobo
were
we
managed
had
by Puppet?
the MS SQL Server and mostly EIS, VEES. Those were the two main systems I had. I also had like a development machine which had to install everything under the sun, including Visual Studio. Those were the 3 main systems I got to manage there. Luckily, I did not much other differentiations were there. At Sanoma, which is my current project, they basically only have EES, as I'm trying to convince most people to ditch it for Linux. But they have a few projects that are using .NET, and in that case it becomes logical that they have to run on the EES. Most of the time it's EES. Like a question all the way in the back.
Oh, hey, is it on? Well, okay, so a question regarding Chocolatey. Were you using the central repository? So online, are your servers to connect? Are your servers able to connect to the internet, or were you using a custom repository, or is that even possible?
Chocolatey can use a custom repository. The question was, are we using the internet one? Until now, I haven't had to figure out how to build your own custom repository, because the machines that I set up did have internet access, and we use Chocolatey as a shortcut to get a few things installed. Also with Kobo, I started too late with Chocolatey, so there I spent most of my time figuring it out how to do it by hand, in which case I manually download images from an internal web server and start installing them by hand. Chocolatey works much the same way. You can build like a static web server with files on it and then fetch it by telling Chocolatey that in base it should look at that server instead of the public repository one. So this is mostly from what I've had when I was reading through the docs, because I wanted to know if it was possible. Luckily, he didn't make it that much more complicated than like a flat file web server with a certain directory structure. You don't have to run repository generators like with Debian or RPMs.
Since I'm always interested in upgrading, when you're running Puppet on Windows, do you have it running as a daemon service process, or do you run it like something, well, I don't know, Windows, like from cron? And if you run it in either way, have you already had the opportunity of upgrading Puppet using Puppet?
Yeah, so the question was, where does Puppet run from in Windows and how is it upgrading? So it runs as a daemon process. The only process you have cron-like on Windows is the scheduler, and when you use that from Puppet, you are limited to like once a day and not smaller increments. This, I think, is a bug, because the scheduler can take it, but maybe it's a backwards compatible thing. As for upgrading, I make Puppet upgrade itself, and that works fine when you're upgrading. Downgrading gives issues. So I upgrade Puppet very frequently on Windows in my Vagrant environment, because very often the Vagrant environment is behind 1 or 2 versions, and I try to follow the current builds. So every time I install a Windows machine, the first thing it does is upgrade itself using Puppet, and that works fine. If you're upgrading, it's nearly painless. Well, I think then the questions are done, and we are done a bit earlier, so we have more time for coffee.
Thank you.